In the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss with you intelligence gathering as it's relevant both to the course in general, to counterterrorism, and also to the simulation. And the comments I will offer in the coming minutes are in addition to the readings in Chapter 7. So the point here is not to repeat Chapter 7, because my assumption is that you have read Chapter 7 or you will read Chapter 7. What I would like to do here is to highlight a couple of issues that I think are of particular importance for you in order to understand the intelligence gathering aspect of counterterrorism. Intelligence is gathered primarily from three distinct sources. One is human sources, the second is signal intelligence, and the third is open source information. Let's begin with human sources, humanint. Human intelligence is when a case officer from the intelligence community meets with a source. And those of you who have watched any number of TV shows, whether it's Law and Order or Miami Vice or CSI or whatever other TV shows are available or movies, you'll oftentimes see that a detective meets with a source. A source, it's an individual, it's a human being, is someone who for a number of different reasons has decided to provide the state with information relevant to the plannings or the future plannings of a particular criminal organization, in our case, a terrorist organization. Someone decides to become a source primarily, never say 100%, for the following reasons. One, they're making a deal. They themselves perhaps they know there's information against them, so they may be themselves prosecuted. And in order to minimize the potential harm to them from the criminal process, they decide to provide the state with information, so they're engaged in a quid pro quo. The second reason is that they perhaps have a grudge against someone, and so it's a little bit of getting back at someone. And the third reason is perhaps they believe, even though they belong to our terrorist organizations and they themselves were perhaps terrorists, they've come to the conclusion that terrorist organizations work against the best interests of their particular community. And so for them, the best way that they can effectively counter terrorism is providing information to the state. So in terms of the three options, because it's in my best interest, a quid pro quo, because I have a grudge, or because I don't believe in terrorism anymore, I would say the first reason is the predominant reason. But the mere fact that someone is willing to provide information in and of itself doesn't mean that the case officer has to believe every word that they're told. And that's why you need to be very, very sensitive to a 4-part test that will enable you to determine whether or not you can actually act on the information, meaning is that actionable intelligence. You have to determine, you as the case officer, have to determine whether information is reliable, credible, time relevant, and corroborated. What do those terms mean? Reliable means whether or not the source is reliable, but there's a catch-22 here, because if he weren't reliable or if she weren't reliable, you wouldn't rely on them. So there's a little bit of a catch-22, so you need to be really careful when you hear the word reliable. Traditionally, the way the phrase has been used by the intelligence community, it means that that source has provided information in the past. But what do you do with a first-time source? So with a first-time source, you have to be really careful, particularly if you see a fact pattern, whether in a mini simulation or in the main simulation, that this is the first time the intelligence community has worked with the source. You need to put on your skeptical antenna and to be really sensitive to whether or not that particular source can be trusted. That's distinct from a source who in the past has provided information that proved itself correct. That makes them reliable. But it gets even more complicated if you see a fact pattern that says that in the past the source provided information that sometimes was reliable, sometimes not reliable. And that requires you then to really push yourselves, or push the source, quote unquote, in order to determine the reliability of the source and of the information they're providing. The second part is credibility. Credibility means, does the information sound possible? Is it plausible? So here you have to put on a different antenna, not your reliability antenna, but your credibility antenna, which means let's hypothetically say that the source said that Amos Guiora ran a 100-meter dash in 8.3 seconds. Well, that's not credible, because there's just no way that's going to happen. On the other hand, if he said that Guiora ran a 100-meter dash in about 22 seconds, you would say, well, that sounds pretty realistic, that sounds reasonable, plausible. So just because the source said something doesn't mean it's correct. It's incumbent upon you to inquire, in terms of its reliability. Second test, in terms of its credibility, which is no less important than the reliability test. The third is time sensitive. So if the source said that X is going to happen, suicide bomber X is going to do Y, The first question the intelligence community would have to ask itself is, when was the information provided? When did the source hear that information? So if it turns out that the source heard it a year ago, well, in terms of the reliability of it, in terms of the veracity of it, it may have been true a year ago, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true at this very moment. On the other hand, if he said it a week ago, then you would have to say, well, perhaps it takes a week to plan a suicide bombing. You got to put the plan together. You got to put the logistics together. You got to identify where you're going to drop the suicide bomber off. What is a reasonable target? So if the information is a week old, then I would suggest from your perspectives, then you need to really think that this is not only reliable, but credible and time sensitive. And if it's time sensitive, then that means you're shifting from an intelligence gathering mode to an operational mode. Because now you have information that may justify acting on it. The term is actionable intelligence. And if indeed it's actionable intelligence, then again, you're shifting from the intelligence gathering paradigm to the operational paradigm, which are two very different things. The fourth test is it's corroborated. Corroborated is exactly what it sounds like, meaning are there two distinct sources of information with respect to the same possible attack. So let's go back to our suicide bomber. If the human source, the humanit, said that X was planning on a suicide bombing, the question is, can you act on it? Again, is it actionable? And the answer is maybe, with an enormous amount of hesitation and a great emphasis on the maybe, because in order to determine, to act on it, whether or not it is indeed actionable, it's going to have to be corroborated. And corroborated means that there's something that supports that first piece of information. You have to put the two together. In essence, what you're doing here is creating a jigsaw puzzle of information, and the more pieces you have, the more likely it is that indeed the information is correct. And the but here is essential, both in the mini simulations and in the main simulation, note that everything is time sensitive. So you don't have all day long to determine whether or not it is actionable, meaning that at some point you're going to have to act. You're going to have to make that decision, whether to act or not to act. And the corroboration, which in the ideal world, you will have at least two distinct pieces of information that corroborate each other, fitting like a jigsaw puzzle, that's in the ideal. But there's a difference, obviously, in counterterrorism between the aspirational and the realistic. And to be frank, you're going to be pushed in terms of the teams that we've created for you. You're going to be pushed to make decisions quickly. You're going to have to then articulate the decisions, go back to the first mini simulation. And in order to articulate your decision, yes, act or no act, you're going to have to be able to apply this four-part test that I've just articulated to you. In addition to the human intelligence gathering, there's also signal intelligence. The best way to describe signal intelligence is, not to make light of it, but is literally the ability, the state's ability to read your emails before you wrote your email. There are those huge satellites, antennas floating around in the sky that enable the state to wiretap, to eavesdrop, to monitor, to surveil. They are constantly gathering information from a variety of sources called signal intelligence. But it's far more complicated than that. I take you back to the 9/11 Commission, which was written obviously after the attack of 9/11. And there the 9/11 Commission brought to the public's attention two facts which are particularly relevant to us. One, that the U.S. Intelligence Committee heard the chatter prior to 9/11 about a potential attack, which turned out to be the real attack, obviously by Al-Qaeda. So the chatter was heard. The tragedy was that the U.S. intelligence community had an insufficient number of Arabic speakers, meaning, yes, we heard the chatter, but no, we didn't know what it means. So in the context of signal intelligence, it's great that we have this extraordinary equipment and a remarkable technology that enables us to listen to read what people are writing and what people are saying. But that's insufficient. You have to be able to understand the language. And here it's important to note, and I can share this with you based on my own experiences, sources don't speak the way the rest of us do. Not only in addition to the obvious code words, but their slang, their euphemisms, their the way in which they communicate with each other, their verbal communications, are simply different how the rest of us speak. And we in Israel even talk about regular Arabic, which is what obviously the Palestinians speak, and source Arabic, which is a very different language. So the intelligence community it's not enough to gather the information. You have to be able to actually translate the information. You have to understand what the sources are really saying, or what the information that you're picking up electronically, what are they really saying, which requires you to really understand the context of the terrorist and what it is that they're saying one to the other. Again, note in the context of the mini simulations and the simulations, your ability to quote unquote translate what is said is difficult. Full stop. I want to go back for a second, a couple more words about human sources. It's really important, and it's hard in determining whether or not a source, in context of his reliability or her reliability, whether they have a grudge against the person who they are quote unquote outing. It is essential for the intelligence community in determining whether quote unquote there's a grudge to truly understand the relationship between the source and the person who the source is outing. To really understand that relationship means you, the intelligence community, have to be sufficiently schooled, quote unquote, in the inner workings of those terrorist organizations, and who's actor A and who's actor B and who's actor C, and what's the relationship between A and B and A and C and B. That means, and I want to emphasize this, if not re-emphasize it, that the mere fact the source said that X is going to do something is for you to conclude, oh, that's true, will lead you down a rabbit hole that's going to be very difficult for you to dig yourselves out of, because you're really going to have to push to determine what's the relationship between, again, the source and the person being outed. Was there some kind of a previous relationship that went awry? Had perhaps the person who's outed previously ratted on the source? So is this a tit for tat? In addition to that, you always have to ask yourself, what's the position of the source in the terrorist organization? Was the source really in a position to know what was really happening? Or is he perhaps, or she, perhaps embellishing, exaggerating, making a point in order to curry favor with the intelligence community? Because remember what I said previously, that because sources more often than not are doing this as a quid pro quo, from their perspective, there's a benefit, perhaps, to embellishing because they think they'll get, quote unquote, a greater payoff. Payoff can be a financial transaction, can be some kind of a benefit they and or their families receive. And so that means, and I've said this before, but it's really important that you understand this. When you receive information that the source said, do not immediately assume that's correct. That's just the first step in your analysis, because your analysis has to reflect the ability to examine who the source is, what's the relationship between the source and the person, quote unquote, being outed, and the source's position in the pecking order of the terrorist organization, and if they're a former member of the terrorist organization, when did they leave the terrorist organization, and what are the chances that they indeed actually might know what they're actually saying, or again, is it a reflection of embellishment and or exaggeration? The third source of information is what's called open source information. So in the past, it would be newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, Salt Lake Tribune, Boston Globe, BBC, any number of different media outlets. But that clearly has been replaced by not only cable TV, CNN, Fox, but much more complicated than that. The endless amount of blogs, social media, and any other means by which people are communicating today. The blogosphere, or the social media, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and whoever knows what, you people know better than I do, what other sources of social media are available. The intelligence community must be able to monitor that, or must at least be sensitive to that, to read it, to be fully engaged with it, because there's no doubt that terrorist organizations are using social media in the same way that the rest of us use social media. And if we can use social media, they can use social media. And you'll see in the mini simulations and the main simulation, constant reference, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, what other mechanisms of social media. Those are all legitimate means for them to communicate. But because it's open source, it's also more than legitimate for the state to read, to track, to monitor, and to surveil. That does not impose on the state any Fourth Amendment requirements in terms of a warrant requirement. It's not search and seizure because it's open source information. It's publicly available. Anything that's publicly available doesn't, and reading that, when the state reads that, doesn't run afoul of various limits imposed on the state in the context, again, of the Fourth Amendment. So if you take these three, the signal intelligence, the human intelligence, the open source, you apply the four-part test that I've outlined to you, that will enable you to begin the process of assessing whether or not the information that the source has provided to the state and meets the test of actionable intelligence. And that phrase, actionable intelligence, is the trigger or the kickoff to whether or not the state can go to the next step, which is making operational decisions based on the source. When I think back to my career, my 20 years that I spent in the Israel Defense Forces, most calls from the intelligence community begin like this. The source said. That's how conversation begins. And initially I confess that when I first was involved in operational counterterrorism, when I was told the source said, my belief was must be correct. But over the course of time, one learns that the mere fact that a source said does not in and of itself guarantee that what the source said is accurate. And there's nothing more dangerous than making a decision to act on information that later turned out to be incorrect. Are mistakes made? Well, of course mistakes are made. But where the rubber hits the road, or where it gets really hard, is your ability to develop skills that enable you to assess whether indeed you can or cannot move to the next step. Some people will tell you better safe than sorry. Other people will tell you, sometimes you have no choice but to act even though you're not 100% convinced. And on that note, I want to add an important disclaimer, because over the course of the years, students have noted this and sometimes complained, which I will understand. Every decision you will be asked to make, again, in the mini simulation and the main simulation, will be predicated on a lack of information in a time-sensitive environment. Many people complain, and also in real life, decisions are made on imperfect information. You will find yourself being forced to make decisions on what you consider to be insufficient information. You're right, and you will be correct. You will be provided information that will be insufficient for you in terms of your decision making, which is, again, as we wrap this up, for you to start thinking about how to create that jigsaw puzzle. How do you put the distinct and disparate pieces together with the understanding that you will never have all the information. You will not have 100% intelligence picture, because it's dependent, again, human source providing you information as they heard it, as they believed they heard it, then reflecting the case officer's interpretation of that information, reflecting your interpretation of the case officer's interpretation, reflecting what the human source believed they heard or what they saw. In the criminal law context, none of this would be admissible into a court of law, because this is all hearsay. This is double hearsay, if not triple hearsay. On the other hand, operational counterterrorism demands that you make decisions based on imperfect information, trying as quickly as possible, as thoroughly as possible, to analyze and assess the information you've received from the three distinct sources, applying the critical four-part test. When you go through the second mini simulation scheduled for this coming Wednesday and the whole notion of information management and whiteboarding, it's really important that you understand how you received information, how you internalized information, how you articulate it, which will enable you to begin the process of putting together the jigsaw puzzle of intelligence information. I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.